Few words are more misused, misunderstood, or make men more miserable than the word fascism. This word has the uncanny ability to summon both images of crematories and cronies, old world statesmen, and contemporary bearded activists. The term has drifted so far that for many it has simply become, at best, a synonym for authoritarian or racist, or, at worst, a word that has deteriorated to a sheer sonic reverb with almost no conceptual content whatever. This being the case, I want to bring more clarity to a broader audience concerning the meaning and history of this term. The approach of this essay, then, is pedagogical, and the objectives that I want to accomplish are the following. 1. Give a clear expository definition of fascism. This is not to say that the conception used here is generally accepted by all scholars, but a general concept must be supplied in order for this investigation to proceed. 2. I aim to supply a brief historical analysis of central themes that preoccupied fascist thinkers in concreto. That is, I will look at some of the central concepts that fascist thinkers were preoccupied with and see how these concepts, or themes as I call them, are related to the general definition established at the start. 3. I will give a cursory examination of the kinds of people for whom fascism is an attractive ideology. 4. Finally, I will discuss the susceptibility of late modern societies of taking on fascist ideology. What is fascism? It is by no means an easy task to give a precise and clear definition of fascism. Scholars have argued for decades about the possibility of a generic use of the term. When one reads over the literature, one sees that commentators are split into those that focus on the origin of the phenomena, the assumption being that the essence of the term will arise from its origin, or that the idea of fascism is so intrinsically contradictory that no essence of it can be found. There are also those who focus on its significance or legacy, and there are those who focus on its political classification. Looking at some of the founding documents of fascism, it is clear that fascism is nationalistic and statist to a supreme degree. Thus, Giovanni Gentile, the prime philosophical expositor of fascism, says, quote, "Fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus, understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state a synthesis and a unit inclusive of all values, interprets, develops, and potentiates the whole life of a people. No individuals or groups, political parties, cultural associations, economic unions, social classes outside of the state. Fascism is therefore opposed to socialism, to which unity within the state, which amalgamates classes into a single economic and ethical reality, is unknown, and which sees in history nothing but the class struggle." Close quote. Gentile goes on to tell us that fascism is opposed to democracy, understood simply as the rule of the quantitative majority. It is anti-individualistic, holistic, and spiritual. This basic list of traits of fascism can be stressed and given more specificity by the definition given by Griffin in his magisterial book, The Nature of Fascism. Quote, "Fascism is a genus of political ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a polygenetic form of populist ultranationalism." Close quote. That is, fascism is a political ideology that relies on a myth of rebirth, palingenesis. Fascist leaders tend to have a gaze towards the past with the glow of nostalgia giving light to the otherwise dark centuries behind them. This narrative of rebirth, however, is bidirectional, for the fascist looks to the past not only as a source of inspiration, but as the very substance that helps give power to the new regime. This vision also presupposes that the era preceding rebirth is one of decadence, decline, or degeneration, and that these are signs that a new epoch is beckoning. This is not to say that fascism is simply reactionary, but on the contrary, it is revolutionary. Where Gentile states, quote, "It has therefore a form correlated to contingencies of time and space, but it also has an ideal content which makes it an expression of truth in the higher region of the history of thought," close quote. That is, though the essence or notion of fascism is eternal, its expression in concrete reality would be dependent on the historical context that shapes it. Hence, the references to the past cannot be cause for simple replication, but radical recreation. By ultranationalism, I mean, quote, nationalism which goes beyond and hence rejects anything compatible with liberal institutions or with the tradition of Enlightenment humanism which underpins them, close quote. Ultranationalism is a nationalism grounded in the rejection of Enlightenment principles such as universal human rights, pluralism, tolerance, etc. Gentile makes these points clear too. Quote, "In the fascist conception of history, man is man only by virtue of the spiritual process to which he contributes as member of the family, the social group, the nation. Outside history, man is a non-entity. Fascism is therefore opposed to all individualistic abstractions based on 18th century materialism." Close quote. To summarize, fascism is a political ideology that is collectivist, ultranationalist, paleogenetic, and mythopoetic. It is a political ideology that rejects parliamentary negotiations, individual rights and abstraction from the state, and the use of reason to solve political disputes. It is a doctrine of organic nationalism, where the nation is seen as the final authority and spiritual unity and meaning are to be found by the integration of the individual into the fatherland. But this is not all that needs to be said about fascism, for fascism does not just have an ideal definition, but a concrete history of themes and discourses. It is to these that I will now turn. Themes. The central theme of fascist ideology, the guiding light under which all other themes are made resplendent, is conflict. In his famous fragment, Heraclitus said that war was king and god of all. Fascists gave this idea mythic poetic power and political significance. For example, Hitler says in Mein Kampf, "He who would live must fight, and he who does not wish to fight in the world where permanent struggle is the law of life has not the right to exist." Close quote. Gentile adds, fascism wants man to be active and to engage with all his energies. It wants him to be manfully aware of the difficulties. It conceives of life as a struggle in which it behooves a man to win for himself a worthy place. Close quote. A philosopher from Finland once asked Mussolini to give a summary of the importance of fascism. Mussolini replied, "We are against the easy life." Close quote. This emphasis on conflict emerges both from the paleogenetic notion that defines fascism, as well as its links to the historical movements that served as its progenitor. Fascism arose out of the Romantic movement that swept through Europe during the mid-part of the 19th century. Disenchanted by the Enlightenment in its picture of the universe, with its stern determinism, focus on calculation and rationality, and deistic vision of God as a remote watchmaker who constructed the universe but who took no interest in or provided no stewardship over it, the Romantic stressed feeling over thinking, intuition over calculation, action over contemplation, the intensification of experience over sobriety or moderation. They elevated the place of the arts, especially music and poetry, developed the concept of the genius, and sought to see the universe less as an abstract spatial temporal matrix, but more as a living organism with its own vital energy. In Romanticism, then, there was always a tension between the individual and his self-expression, often in the guise of the singular, dynamic artist, and the desire and need for the individual and his work to be incorporated into a greater whole. This conflict between individual and whole, this focus on intensity and the non-rational element in human life, and the resulting conflict and emotional volatility following therefrom, was incorporated into fascist, especially Nazi, ideology. Hence, Alfred Rosenberg, one of the chief theoreticians of Nazi ideology, says this about the Romantics in his book, The Myth of the 20th Century. Quote, "In various guises, an abstraction began to uproot life. The reaction to the non-race-based and universalist view of history in the form of German Romanticism was therefore as welcome as the rain after a long drought." Close quote. The centralization of conflict in fascist doctrine is not only tied to its historical birth certificate, but its doctrine of national renewal. The paleogenetic myth that fascists make use of is not only a doctrine of revival, but at least for the Nazis, and to a lesser degree, the Italian fascists, the perpetuation of revolution and expansion. The paleogenetic myth must point to a golden age of history as a touchstone to draw inspiration from. But this golden age is almost always one in which the nation is martially ascended. Hence, the Italian fascists linking themselves to the imperial glory of Rome. Hitler himself said that Mussolini was the heir of the Caesars, and the Nazi praise of the Holy Roman Empire. Thus, in order for there to be a restoration, or better, recreation of past glory, there must be an attendant rise in military conflict to resurrect the body of a dead empire. As I said earlier, in contrast to the liberalism of the Enlightenment and its utilitarian approach, fascists define themselves as men of action, not contemplation or deliberation. Fascism saw itself as an ideology of movement, force, vitality, and virility. Hence, they saw themselves as the party of action. "We are the party of speed," states Drieu. And as we said earlier, Gentile states that fascism wants man to be active and to engage in action with all his energies. Close quote. This movement, based on action, change, and national renewal, would of course not find an audience among the stagnant, putrefying, dying elements of society. But the fascists knew this and held youth too in high regard. The movement itself grew from disenchanted young men left unemployed after World War I. Fascism, especially the Nazi form, had a great influence among youth groups. But even Bulgarian and Romanian variants of fascism originated in student movements. But this all makes sense. Revolutionary doctrines often appeal to the young, for whom ideas still have a freshness and fire, and who still believe that a new idea, far from being just bubbles to fill in on a Scantron sheet, can actually be a prologue to, or catalyst of, a new age. This focus on youth and physical prowess was indeed very strong. For some writers, gymnastics, here meaning an all-encompassing term for physical training, was seen as more important than book learning. This also translated into a cult of health and an obsession, in Nazism at least, with biological integrity. This emphasis on youth, strength, health, combined with the idea of life as an unceasing struggle and that the weak should be discarded, would eventually lead to the practice of eugenics. The fascist love of the non-rational covered both ends of the spectrum of human existence. For just as they were amazed by the full bloom of manly excellence and feminine iridescence shown in youth, so were they impressed by the long umbra that hovers over us all, the possibility of my impossibility, as Heidegger terms it, that is, death. Eco, in his essay on fascism, points out that, quote, in non-fascist societies, the lay public is told that death is unpleasant, but must be faced with dignity. Believers are told that it is a painful way to reach a supernatural happiness. By contrast, the Euro-fascist hero craves heroic death, advertised as the best reward for a heroic life. Close quote. There is truth in this statement by Eco. but it is incomplete. It is true that dying a heroic death was the greatest capstone of a life for the fascists, and many rushed headlong to death for this reason. But the fascist concentration on death was an extension of their focus on limit cases in general. The fascists wanted to bring experiences at the margins of life and at the edges of reason into the very center of life itself. Hence, orgasm and ecstasy, mystical transfiguration, musical rapture, combat adrenaline were all valorized. The fascists attempted an inverse mirroring of the artist in his ability to take distilled aspects of experience, like falling in love, mourning the dead, and intense fear, and turn them into a concentrated aesthetic experience. Thus, a whole history of a love affair, if the artist is great, can be summed up in a few pages of prose or a few minutes of song. The fascists wanted to not condense these experiences, but to expand them. They wanted the whole of life to be a crescendo. They wanted human existence itself to be transfigured into a novel. This is why Benjamin famously said that, quote, fascism seeks to give them, the masses, an expression while preserving property. The logical result of fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into politics. Close quote. Benjamin was on the right track, but he did not go far enough. Fascism, an ideal, is a totalitarian system and thus wants to bring the whole of a person's existence under the domain of the nation and its political body. It follows then that the introduction of aesthetics into politics, or more accurately the aestheticization of politics, in a system in which political influence is total, is nothing other than the aestheticization of existence itself, understood not simply as an abstract political ideology, but as a lived worldview and creed. Fascism is a battle against banality. Hence, death in fascism is great also because it is the climax of the artistic work that should be one's life. Not only this, but death and the situation leading up to it reveals the very character of the actor on life stage. As Hitler states, quote, just as in our daily life, the so-called man of genius needs a particular occasion, and sometimes indeed a special stimulus, to bring his genius to light, so too in the life of the people. The race that has genius in it needs the occasion and stimulus to bring that genius to expression. War offers an excellent occasion for observing this phenomenon. In times of distress, when the others despair, apparently harmless boys suddenly spring up and become heroes, full of determination, undaunted in the presence of death, and manifesting wonderful powers of calm reflection under such circumstances. If such an hour of trial did not come, nobody would have thought that the soul of a hero lurked in the body of that beardless youth. Close quote. From the above quote, we see that the fascist obsession with death is a fascination with what the confrontation with death reveals about the person. The heroic power of an individual cannot be seen until conditions of difficulty are in place. The confrontation with death is the condition of difficulty par excellence. This is the case for the nation just as much as it is for the individual. And since it is the case that fascism wants to make life as a whole a heroic and artistic display, and since this can be done best under conditions of extreme difficulty, conditions when one is faced with one's own mortality, it follows that war is the condition best suited for the awakening of heroism and for revealing the geniuses of the nation and the greatness of the nation itself. Here, again, Benjamin was on the right track. Quote, all efforts to render politics aesthetic culminates in one thing, war. Close quote. The aesthetic aspect of this form of politics has been commented on by many, but more recent scholarship has focused more on the sacralized nature of fascism. The fascists not only saw themselves as artists of the realm of action, but as high priest of a novel cult. That is, fascism was a form of politics that borrowed heavily from religion, especially in terms of symbolism and ritual. The religious and the state dimensions of fascism were mutually enforcing, if not wholly intertwined. This fact can be shown both from the writings of many of its theoretical progenitors and propagators, as well as from the history of many of its artistic projects. As far as the former is concerned, fascism, as a form of romantic nationalism, I will say more about this later, wanted to construct a symbolic world of myth and ritual, wanted to construct its own symbolic world of myth and ritual. The template used in the Italian variant of fascism was derived from secret societies and Freemasons, but also had its genesis in the fact that many nationalists in Italy at the time saw the construction of a civil or political religion as providing the framework needed for unity. Here too, the shadow of the First World War influenced the character that fascism would take on. Because of the cultural climate of the time, many of the young men were ready to sacrifice themselves for a cause, any cause, if it elevated them above the prosaic surface of everyday life. Just as importantly, the war provided the raw cultural material for a politics of myth-making. Deaths of the soldiers in the war, for example, could easily be translated into the language of martyrdom. For if the blood of the martyrs was the seed of the church, so too could it be the seeds for the fatherland. Hence, we are told, quote, "The Holy Communion of war has molded us all with the same metal of generous sacrifice." Close quote. Elsewhere it is said, quote, "A good fascist is religious. We are for a fascist mysticism because it has its own martyrs and devotees, and because it positions an entire people around an idea, rendering them humble." Close quote. What is more, the fascist utilization of religion can be seen in its institutional and artistic displays as well. For example, in 1930, a school of fascist mysticism was established in Milan, Italy. The Italian fascists borrowed much from their native Roman Catholicism. For instance, the fascist ritual of La Fascista, an initiation ceremony of youths into the fascist party, was modeled after the Catholic practice of confirmation, in which those at the, quote, age of discretion are brought fully into the life of the church. This ritual was a public one, carried out in all major Italian cities, but the most significant one was carried out in Rome. Young people were given a party card and a rifle by Mussolini himself. It explained that, quote, "The card is a symbol of our faith. The rifle is the instrument of our strength." Close quote. Furthermore, during the early 1930s, the Italian fascists built towers with bells that would ring during every fascist ceremony. Additionally, quote, "A public subscription campaign was launched for the building of the PNC's national headquarters in Rome, the Cancelleria. Through the people's financial support, the Cancelleria would have embodied the incomparable energy furnished by the nation's soul to the fascist revolution." Close quote. A lively debate began among the major Italian architects of the time, above all over the symbolic function of the party's headquarters, as, quote, "the temple where new fascist youth would be forged." Close quote. Their plans provided for a huge office building, a fascist tower, with a vestry for party banners, a shrine for the martyrs of the fascist revolution, and a huge open space for the hierarchy's mass rallies and the party ceremony. The site chosen for the building was near Ferro Mussolini, currently the Italian Foreign Office, because, as an official publication explained, it represented a significant physical reconciliation between the center from which the spirit of the fascist idea is spread and the gymnasium in which the new youths of Italy will steer their bodies in order to bring greater glory to the fatherland. This focus on ritual was not confined to architectural symbolism, but to, as the church calls it, first and last things. That is, just as death was a central point in fascist aesthetics, so too was it a focal point in its sacralized view of politics. This can be seen by the fact that the funerals of dead party members became the most solemn fascist display. The climax of the ceremony was when the names of all the dead would be read aloud. All those present would respond, "Here," after the reading of each name. This act would represent the continued presence of the deceased within the immortal, collective memory of the state, a kind of modernized form of the cultural immortality proposed by Plato in the Symposium. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the sacred dimensions of fascism can be seen through the cult of the leader that it propagated. Earlier in this essay, I quoted a definition of fascism with populism as a key element, but until now this point was not a salient one. Populism, in the context of liberal democratic societies, represents the people's desire to have their needs voiced directly instead of being mediated by established institutions like the media, corporations, nonprofits, etc. The goal of populism is more direct democratic expression by making leaders directly responsive to the needs and desires of the majority of citizens. Fascism, rejecting democracy, cannot accept the populism of this sort. So, while fascist leaders talk of themselves as expressing the spirit of the people, this spirit of the people is not the same as the will of the people. When fascist leaders talk of the spirit of the people, they mean the cultural, racial, linguistic, and geographical elements of the nation that best exemplify the values that they themselves expound. When Hitler talks of the Volk, for example, he does not include Jews in this description. And what he really means by the people of Volk are Aryans and strong health, who are members of the Nazi Party and supporters of its ideology. This form of populism, based not on the quantitative will of the majority, but instead on a select element within a nation, which is said to exemplify the true essence of the country as a whole, I will term as qualitative populism, as opposed to the quantitative populism found in liberal democratic societies. Nevertheless, even in fascism, the idea of the populist leader having a special connection to the citizens is kept, or rather intensified. Hannah Arendt's observations are instructive here. In this sense, totalitarianism, eliminates the distance between the rulers and the ruled. He, the totalitarian ruler, is not a power-hungry individual imposing a tyrannical and arbitrary will upon his subjects. Being a mere functionary, he can be replaced at any time, and he depends just as much on the will of the masses he embodies as the masses depend on him. Close quote. Hitler knew this well. In the speech he gave to 30,000 of his SA men, he had the following to say, quote, "I conducted the fight for 14 years. I founded this SA, and in its ranks and at its fore, led the movement onward for 14 years. I have come to know you, and I know everything you are through me, and everything I am through you alone. The movement has given to the German Volk an element of oneness and unity which will long have an effect, far into the most distant future. Those who believe that this movement is still bound today to a single person are mistaken. I was its herald, and today from this one herald have come millions." Close quote. Hence, fascistic populism was of a spiritualistic sort, anchored in the idea of destiny, providence, and the interdependence of the leader and the people. The cult of the leader as expressing the spiritual essence of the nation as a whole. This was not just the case in Nazi Germany, but fascist Italy as well. Commentators have pointed out rightly that the cult of Mussolini was not the basis of the fascist political religion, but a consequence of it. Quote, The charismatic figure of the leader is linked to the entire structure of fascism's symbolic world and cannot be treated as a separate element, just as the figure of the Pope cannot be extrapolated from the Catholic Church. Close quote. Put schematically, the definition of fascism is a paleogenetic form of populist ultranationalism. Its essential theme is conflict or struggle, and its distinctive form of public populism is based upon immediacy. This focus on the intuitive and the immediate not only took the form of religion and aesthetics, but also touched on how the fascists, especially Nazis, dealt with the problem of race. The qualitative populism that informed the cult of the leader, promulgated by Hitler, was based on a racial philosophy of history that demands explication. The race question. First, I must state at the onset that fascism, in essence, may not be inherently racist. If one subscribes to a supremacist view of racism based on biological features. On a systemic understanding of racism, fascism is most likely inherently racist. The original Italian variant of fascism was not formed on the basis of race at all. This is why Gentile explicitly states that a nation is, quote, not a race, nor a geographically defined region, but a people, historically perpetuating itself, a multitude unified by an ideal, imbued with the will to live, the will to power, self-consciousness, personality, close quote. Mussolini states that, quote, race is a feeling and not a reality, 95% a feeling, close quote. Now, of course, the German variant of fascism, Nazism, was undoubtedly racist. The reason for this is grounded in the special circumstances surrounding the emergence of Nazism. The concept of the Volk, or the people, as one of the central ideas of German nationalism, emerged forcefully during the Romantic period. The concept of the Volk was the concept of a national, unified organic people. Just as the individual was a center of spiritual spontaneity in Romanticism, so the nation and the cosmos was ensouled. More importantly, the concept of the Volk was intrinsically related to the idea of rootedness. Quote, the landscape thus became a vital part of the definition of the Volk, through which it retained continuous contact with the life spirit of the transcendent cosmos. In this respect, the desired reality was charged with both emotional values and rural aspirations, not within the city, but in the landscape. The countryside native to him was man fated to merge with and become rooted in nature and the Volk, and only in this process, taking place in the native environment, would every man be able to find his self-expression and his individuality. Close quote. It was in part this connection of the Volk, the people, with its natural environment and the exclusionary aspect that came with it that helped lay the foundation for the rise of Nazism. Of course, the Nazis looked upon this and transformed this concept of the Volk and its connection to the landscape into a racialized philosophy of history with the following axioms. First, the Nazis were proponents of racial essentialism. They believed that races have distinct ontological characteristics. Different races have different intrinsic natures. Two, not only were the races ontologically different, but they were axiologically distinct. There is a hierarchy of racial factions, at the top of which is the Aryan race. 3. Recorded history can be seen as the history of Aryan domination and the subsequent degradation of a culture based upon miscegenation. That is, Aryans would traverse the world and acquire leadership positions in a given culture or land. The Aryans, while they ruled, would leave their stamp on the new land, which would result in the flowering of culture, art, religion, politics, and philosophy. Eventually, the Aryans would breed with the locals, and this would result in a decline in the culture. The locals would be able to sustain the high levels of cultural elevation for a while, but they would not be able to advance the culture, and it would eventually stagnate and then regress. Finally, though it is the case that fascism, on some understandings of racism, may not be intrinsically racist as a concept, it is nonetheless true that fascism would almost always have racist effects in its implementation. This is the case because the very idea of ultranationalism is grounded in the idea of hyperconformity that can only really be established by a group of people that is as uniform in its composition as possible. This uniformity and insularity will cause many to look upon difference with a high degree of intensity and distrust. The allure of fascism in our current political climate. To close, with the resurgence of nationalistic sentiments and movements in our own time, which many have mistakenly termed fascist, and the contemporary preoccupation with young men and their susceptibility to radical ideology, I find it to be a good time to examine some of the conditions that might lead people to take up fascism, both the social conditions necessary to facilitate its emergence and those needed for its general acceptance. More granularly, I will examine 1. Some of the socio-economic and political conditions that facilitated the rise of fascism, 2. Say some brief remarks about certain psychological features that may predispose one to accept the doctrine, and 3. Finally, I will see what parallels of these psychological and sociological conditions can be found contemporaneously, and how our new digital culture may influence these conditions. According to one sociological reading, the one proposed by Hannah Arendt, the rise of totalitarian ideologies, fascism included, was facilitated by the awakening of a politically indifferent mass of people who had no loyalty to classes, unions, or hardly any civic institution. Since this group of people had no experience of political life and no attachment to the usual discourse of politics, they were susceptible to a new and more naked form of propaganda. Added to this, the social collapse following the First World War produced a large group of unemployed soldiers, disenchanted with their situation. This situation of dejection and resentment was at first turned inwards, for despite the fact that this dejection and alienation was common and structural in nature, this did not stop those individuals from judging themselves as failures in relation to the standards of the old social order. Unable to contribute to the nation and estranged from their social class, these individuals, again, often young men, began to see themselves as lacking all worth. This resulted in an intense brooding on their own shortcomings, which had as an upshot a self-centeredness that was concorded with a disregard for their own self-preservation. The result, a psyche as malleable as clay, awaiting the shaping hands of an ideology to give it form and function. It must also be added, as many commentators have noted, World War I transformed the political horizons of those who made it back from battle. The same martial attitudes, capacities, and in many cases reverence for violence and valorization of regimented life became a fixture of the new political culture. As the literature has it, there was a brutalization of politics, and the acceptance of violence in both ethos and action was seen as a normal feature of the political world. This brutalization was also accompanied by the creation of a new quasi-separatist warrior class. The experience of trench warfare, which bounded millions together for long periods of time, created an atmosphere of collectivism, self-sacrifice, regimentation, shared identity, and sense of purpose that was easily reactivated once soldiers returned from war. The antidote to the alienation that many young men experienced once returning from the war was the reactivation of their militarized identities, and fascism, which was the best doctrine for absorbing this combination of martial impulse and collectivist sensibility, was seen as very seductive for this new class of young men. What is more, though ideologically fascists define themselves as third positionists, neither socialist, nor liberal. As far as the social impact of their politics went, it has often been seen, especially by those on the left, as a reactionary force, energized by the material desperations of either a petit bourgeois that was losing its usefulness in the wake of intensified industrialization, 2, a bourgeois losing its political and economic power through gains made by the working class and the expansion of democracy, or 3, the reactionary impulses of big business, corporations, etc., to the expansion of labor rights or progressive taxation and the fear that they, and even the bourgeois, had of the possibility that full socialism could be implemented in light of the success of the Bolshevik Revolution. Finally, fascism could not have developed without the rise in mass political parties resulting from the expansion of voting rights that occurred in the latter half of the 19th century. Segments of the right realized that they could rule through manipulation of the masses instead of restricting the franchise. To this end, fascists developed a strong propagandistic arsenal and embraced a kind of populism. The question that is important for us now is this: are these same historical, political, and sociological conditions that led to fascism operative now? And should we be concerned about the resurfacing of fascism? In the next section, I will see if the main structural aspects of fascism are being reactivated in our contemporary context. First, by investigating the degree of alienation young men face in late modern societies, primarily focusing on the United States. Second, by investigating if our politics are taking on the same brutalized form that Europe's did on the eve of fascism's rise. Third, I will say a few brief remarks about if the middle class and the corporations are taking on a reactionary posture in the political sphere. The background conditions that could contribute to young men's alienation can be found today in many parts of the West. In a society in which wages do not keep pace with the cost of living, health outcomes of the emergent generation are projected to worsen, when the sexual and dating sphere too begins to become more stratified and difficult, with a decline in organized religion and uptick in friendlessness, it is not hard to see why a doctrine that preaches against the contemporary order and calls for a restoration and recreation of some golden age might have its appeal. Fascism appeals most to young, alienated men, and it gives them tools to cope with their alienation in the following way. It offers the possibility of integration. Fascism, being a highly insular doctrine that gives prominence to a very small group over the individual, gives a lost soul a community to belong to and a sense of meaning. This sense of community is actually amplified because of the contemporary context of Western society. That is, many young men are attracted to communities that, though not fascist in themselves, nonetheless foster an ethos of anonymity, anarchy, and transgression that some may argue paves the way for the adoption of radical political beliefs, fascism being one of them. One such community that arose online is that of 4chan. 4chan is an image board that was created in 2003. The layout and the structure of the site was based on a popular Japanese image board called Futa Channel, or 2chan. As said before, the culture of the site is built around principles of anarchy, anonymity, irony, and transgression. Some forums on the site are repositories of gore, posts, pornography, transgressive jokes, and of course, trolling. The site retains its ambiance of anonymity through a combination of structural aspects of the website and of social shaming. So, for example, posts are pushed off the front page very quickly and even removed from the server once they reach about page 14 or so. Users also rarely post with a consistent username, preferring the generic alias of anonymous or anon. Also, the users seeking to raise their clout and differentiate themselves from others are mocked as, quote, name fags. In a culture increasingly preoccupied with notoriety, the anonymous form can be seen as a welcomed oasis, a place where one is not judged by the brutal status hierarchy that is becoming increasingly punishing in both the economic and sexual domains. The posted content itself is all that matters. This anonymity itself would prove to be the most important precondition for the explosion of a subculture of irony, self-referential humor, and the externalization of the darker impulses of the culture that were kept from view by the strictures of what was left of the institutional gatekeepers. For it is when no one knows who you are that you can become who you are. This was a subculture that snickered at what they perceived as the conformity, stupidity, and perhaps most importantly of all, the sheer blandness of the mainstream culture and media, and sneered at the zombified state of the so-called normies that imbibed its contents. But there was always an ambiguity pertaining to how serious this all was. Political views and language far outside of even the cusp of acceptability were bandied about, and there was rarely clarity about if this was simply transgressive irony to own the normies and troll each other, the genuine articulation of radical views that could find a hearing nowhere else, or some kind of combination of the two, and if a combination, which aspect was the more influential? This question became more urgent as the site's culture drifted rightward. The status quo represented by the mainstream had, since Clinton, been center-right economically, while center-left socially. But over the next 30 years, the left will begin to gain a stronger form of cultural dominance, as there was a rapid movement on issues such as same-sex marriage and other LGBTQ+ rights issues. There is also the election of the first black president, the blooming of obscure subcultures with whole taxonomy of gender classifications, and the normalizing of the critical discourses that arose in the 1970s but that now began to drift into the mainstream. It is hard to know what caused this accelerated move leftward, but we speculate that it owes much to the increased numbers of those enrolling in universities, since some data seems to suggest that university education pushes people to the left. There's also the fact of demographic transformation as the United States and some other Western nations became less white. Lastly, the leftward movement could be the result of liberalism's own internal trajectory. For the non-relational and culturalist subject posited by liberal doctrine lends itself well to a politics of self-creation and gender exploration. Whatever the causes, the culture seemed to be moving leftward, and hence the status quo, for those on 4chan, began to be represented by the left liberal. This would prove extremely important for the perceived dominance of the left liberals in the culture, along with the perception that this incarnation of the left wanted to police speech and censor the dark, transgressive humor of 4chan denizens, led many on the platform to support Trump's campaign. The time of triggering normies had passed, and the era of owning the libs was upon us. The incel community is yet another community that young, alienated men tend to turn to that could induce radical beliefs. The incel community is held together not simply based upon their status as being sexually/romantically deprived, but by their acceptance of what is called the black pill. The black pill is a quasi-fatalistic and pessimistic interpretation of human mate selection. The idea being that physical looks, especially the least changeable features such as facial bone structure, height, racial phenotype, and skeletal body proportions, are the most important components to romantic success. Those who fall short of an acceptable baseline in one of these four domains, especially facial bone structure and height, without exorbitant money or status to compensate, or plastic surgery, are doomed to a sexless existence. Or, in incel parlance, it's over. This biological analysis is coupled with a bizarre, eroticized socioeconomics. There is a sexual marketplace. The economic metaphor shows how deeply the logic of neoliberalism has penetrated our culture, based on the same basic principles of supply and demand as the monetary economy. The argument made by incels and some others is that there has been a disturbance and the sexual marketplace. The erotic value of women has shot up with the advent of internet culture. Social media and dating apps have exposed women to a level of attention that boggles the mind, and this, combined with women's so-called hypergamous nature, which inclines them to pick the best possible partners, has made the threshold that men have to meet all the higher. This state of affairs is stressed by the fact that young women now make more than young men and are graduating university at higher rates, so the probability of beta buxing, or the exchanging of economic provisioning for sexual access, has also fallen. The result is that Chads, the attractiveness equivalent to the top 5% economically, has most of the sexual success. I've touched on incels and 4chans because they showcase most clearly the picture of some of the most extreme aspects of the alienated young male psyche. Also, these communities and their ideas are said to be dangerous and connected to violent attacks, often political or quasi-political ones, that some think may evidence a brutalization of our political culture that is analogous to the situation in Europe preceding fascism. The attacks of Elliot Rodgers, Scott Byrell, Chris Harper Mercer, George Sardini, and Alec Menashin all were connected to the doctrines, forms, or condition of inceldom. Rodgers and Harper Mercer were likely both 4chan posters as well. One example of this linking of current online subcultures to a possible rise in fascism comes from Nagel and Siegel, writing in the wake of the Charlottesville incident. The point of connection that they see between contemporary right-wing extremists and the fascists of the past is the aestheticization of the political and the attitude of resentment. Their point requires extensive quotation. The rise of digital fascism and online subcultures, once celebrated for their subversive power, is not a break with their origin, but in fact continuous with them. The alt-right was never in doubt about the purposes and uses of 4chan's trolling culture, as an essay on countercurrents, an influential alt-right publication, made clear. Quote, "The one thing Paul respects is power, and those without it are fair game for ridicule by virtue of it being not only hilarious, but morally justified in the spitting upon one's enemies." Close quote. The right wing knew what progressives are only beginning to realize. Laws wasn't just an amoral defiance of moral categories. It was an ethical claim. Through years of pre-political collective bullying, it trained those who would go on to be alt-right to deprogram the moral codes that might cause feelings of guilt and empathy by aestheticizing the collective dehumanization of enemies. In recent years, two powerful currents in trolling came together to produce the digital vanguard of the alt-right. One was opposition to political correctness and the increasingly censorious nature of mainstream liberalism. The other was a creeping despair, namely white men who had the most status to lose, reacted with the greatest vehemence. Some became embittered and joined together in subcultural communities of resentment. They saw themselves not just as victims of circumstance, but came to believe that they had been cheated out of their rightful power and influence by a conspiracy of interlopers, women, minority, Jews. Close quote. It would seem that the very trends that Nagel and Siegel observed would reach their apotheosis in the Christchurch shooting. Here was the ultimate marriage of trolling and terror, the style of mimetic irony and the substance of actual violence. This point seems substantiated by the shooter's recording the shooting, using meme music on his way to the massacre, citing Candace Owens as an influence in his manifesto, and beginning the video with the now dated exhortation to subscribe to PewDiePie. With all of this analysis behind us, it would seem that we are indeed on an overhang, peering down into the fascist abyss. On the contrary, I do not see the reestablishment of fascism in our future. First, there are at least two alternatives, or at least supplementary, ways to understand the point of trolling in the Christchurch case. First, there is the covert nihilist interpretation. On this reading, white nationalism or eco-fascism is nothing but a pretense. The shooter was not committed to white nationalism itself, but to the ethos of violence and destruction that is almost always present in fascist communities and ideologies, for obvious reasons. The shooter used the white nationalist cause to cloak his nihilistic violence in the garb of racial valor. On this reading, the shooter exposes one of the many paradoxes of fascism. Despite being a doctrine that strongly rejects nihilism, it is perhaps the ideology most easily infiltrated by it. On the other hand, one could hold to the narcissistic reading. On this reading, the shooter was driven more by the joy he took in the projection of his own fame and the media attention that would facilitate it than by defending the white race. More importantly, there are fundamental differences between the digital fascists and the original ones when it comes to how politics was aestheticized, how violence and transgression was operative, and how tightly each movement was bound together. Strictly speaking, I don't think many of these men were fascists at all, and only continue to use the term digital fascist to stay consistent with Nagel and Siegel's usage. The aestheticized politics that is practiced by the so-called digital fascists is dissimilar to the original version in important respects. The old aestheticization was one of publicity and pageantry linked to the development of mass political parties. The new aestheticization is private and digitized and becomes risible when displayed offline. The old aestheticization reinforced the sacred and cloaked itself in the virtues of honor, self-sacrifice, and discipline. The new aestheticization is amoral and a-religious and is cloaked in irony, subterfuge, misdirection, and comedy. The way that violence and exhibitions of force were made use of by digital and original fascists also differed. Original fascists showcased violence in a regimented, coordinated, public, and mass-based way. The violence of the digital fascists is sporadic and diffuse, rarely public, disorganized, and usually carried out by loners. The original fascists were closely connected by the shared experience of war and the pressure of battle. They knew each other at the physical level without the distancing of the digital, the barrier of anonymity, or the barricade of irony. The virtual fascists communicate in digital darkness, unsure if in contact with persons or personas, an earnest interlocutor or a troll only in it for the laws. In sum, the original fascists aestheticized politics, while the digital fascists politicized aesthetics. The original fascists were dangerous, while the digital fascists are decadent. This fact could be discerned by paying close attention to the forms these young men populated, and the social and technological conditions that contextualize their participation. The alienation of young men in Europe after the war was qualitatively different than the kind experienced by the young men today. The post-World War I men of Europe were alienated but not atomized, and though civic life and institutions were in decline, the communal spirit of martial life carried over to civilian existence. The alienation of modern young men is based upon atomization, romantic, economic, and/or social failure, and decorporization. As is known by now, civic, social, and political institutions have weakened in many Western nations. This has left many lonely and isolated. This has combined with, as we have said above, a more ruthless and competitive sexual and economic terrain. This being the case, it seems only natural that young men would flock to the online world both to alleviate their loneliness and to express their grievances. But this has major consequences. These young men are already immersed in a social system of virtual realms that sublimates the needs of real life. The world of video games relieves the need for personal achievement, pornography for sex and intimacy, and now the online forum for community and friendship. Almost all of the important areas of the young man's life have a digitized correlate that supplies in the virtual what is lacking in the physical. This fact can begin to transform the young man's relationship to existence. The physical world can become bland and take on a sense of unreality. His connection to his own body can begin to fade, drowned out by the virtual immersion. Temporally, he is seized by anemoia, nostalgia for a time he's never known. But this is grounded in an incoherent pastiche of images of times past, reflected from relics of popular culture and incomplete historical records. If this depersonalization is intensified, he will begin to stray deeper into the digital, and this will cause him to sublimate his desires with objects dissimilar from their real-world counterparts. His aesthetic tastes now move towards the animated. He may even take on a female animated avatar on some forms, and he will now talk of the superiority of 2D women over their 3D counterparts, extol the virtues of hentai, and mock those who watch 3D pornography as so-called cucks. I say all this to drive home the point that killers like Elliot Rodgers and others are not the paradigmatic example of the alienated online male. Rodgers and his fellow shooters are examples of a kind of weaponized alienation. That is, the same sense of worthlessness and selflessness, in the sense of disregard for oneself, that the individual may have felt for himself, is now externalized. So now the objects that occasion the feelings of worthlessness in the person, being rejected by women, or seeing other ethnic groups doing better than one's own, are themselves seen as worthless. And the same disregard that he showed towards himself that could have culminated in depressive suicide is now rechanneled into the possibility of homicidal rage. Weaponized alienation, however, is a rare example of alienation than the aesthetic form I mentioned above. The emblem of the alienated male is the anime avatar, not the AR-15, and this group of men are more accurately characterized not as politicized digital rebels, but as tragic estates of virtual being. Conclusion. The question of fascism has, of late, moved away from the online discourse and turned instead to the public language of institutional politics. Certain curious actions of the United States president when it comes to recent uprisings, a divisive op-ed published in the paper of record, and the extension of emergency powers to the Hungarian head of state have made some question of fascism may not come from the alienated men from below, but instead come from the powerful ones above. The answer to this question is the same, however, at least I think, as the one given in regards to young men. Fascism is not on its way. In the United States, the current crisis has actually led to a resurgent federalism, for better or worse, and this does not line up with the centralization of power that took place during the rise of fascist regimes. Far from being fascist, the current president can hardly do authoritarianism properly. As one conservative writer puts it, quote, Trump is instead fundamentally more farcical than threatening, too decadent himself to be a real threat to the system, close quote. Furthermore, the elites and middle classes do not see their place threatened by any leftist project. The Democratic Party, which seems poised to win the next presidential election, is gaining its momentum from rather affluent suburbanites who are tired of Trump's political theater and executive incompetence. Also, there is no pressure on the elites to engage in a political reaction. They have benefited the most from the contemporary crisis and are gaining much cultural capital via their symbolic support of the contemporary uprisings. So fascism, materialistically conceived as a class reaction of elites and bourgeois in society, is unnecessary. We are too complacent, too isolated, too stagnant for fascism. And that is a good thing. But our complacency, which shields us from the worst of possibilities, may also guard us from much better ones. Quote, "The earth has become small, and on it hops the last man, who makes everything small. His race is as ineradicable as the flea beetle. The last man lives longest."